Hello again, my name is Justin Stairs and this is the Brussels Signal studio. We're very happy to have José Gusmão, who is an MEP from the Left Bloc. Welcome and thank you again for finding the time to come in and see us.
Thank you.
As usual, we have a list of subjects that we'd like to talk about, but maybe we could start out, again, as usual, with just a couple of minutes on you and your background. As I understand it, you're a former economist. In fact, we have some economic subjects to talk about. But you were originally a communist, but now you're a socialist. Is that fair?
Yeah, I was a member of the Communist Youth and the Communist Party for several years. And eventually there was an internal debate on what we could consider a political, an internal renewal of the party, in which the big debate was the issue of democracy within the party.
Within Portugal, I should have pointed out, yes.
In Portugal, yes. And I belonged to the number of members of the party that wished to have big changes in the way the party worked. Which also affected the way in which we related with national politics and even international politics. And well, the decision didn't go my way, let's put it like this, and I decided that I wanted to take my political activism to other areas.
It didn't go your way? What do you mean by that?
Well, there was no interest in changing the party in the way that we were proposing. And when I say we, I would say a number of people that were critical of the way the party worked. And I would say that what we had in common was the importance of democracy in the internal workings of the party, but also in its project, and that affected, for instance, the relationship of the party with a number of regimes, but also the way in which the party worked. I mean, it was and still is a party where, for instance, you cannot put forward an alternative platform or a proposal for the leadership of the party.
Oh, I see. And more authoritarian, do you mean?
Well, the thing is, it's a tradition within the communist parties that many communist parties have abandoned, and which I think doesn't really fit in modern politics. And at that time, the Left Bloc was showing up in Portuguese politics and doing politics in a very different way, and I was drawn to that.
Okay. So is it fair to call the Left Bloc socialist in an old-fashioned sense, or social democrat? Where are we going to? How would you define it?
Well, it's not easy, and that question has been posed to several leaders of the Left Bloc, and I would say that we are an organization that joined different traditions within the Portuguese left, from traditional social democracy to forms of socialism that were critical of the East experiences in socialism.
Okay.
And I would say the most relevant aspect is that we placed ourselves in the Portuguese left on the left of the Socialist Party that to a great extent has abandoned historical social democracy.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say to the right, but to the side of the Portuguese Communist Party, mostly because of the role that we give to some new struggles, and also the way in which we function as a party and in relationship with social movements.
Okay, you mentioned new struggles, for example?
Well, when the Left Bloc appeared, there was a referendum on abortion going on in Portugal, and actually before the Left Bloc appeared, there was a big defeat in a referendum on the legalization of abortion in Portugal, and 8 years later we ended up winning a new referendum on that subject. But
so pro-abortion.
yes,
Right.
and I would say the feminist movement, the LGBT movement, and other civil rights movements weren't that structured at that time, and we wanted to build a left that was able to put all of those movements and also the workers' movement in a more productive dialogue and working together, and in a way bringing things into each other and connecting their struggles. This was and still is a big topic of the Left Bloc's politics.
Okay, and economically speaking, redistribution of wealth, does that expression still exist in?
Yeah. I mean, I would say in terms of political priorities, especially in the context that we have right now in Portugal, the Left Bloc is very focused on labor rights and its, for instance, collective bargaining and its impact on the way wages have been evolving in Portugal, and on the institutions of the welfare state in Portugal. After the democratic revolutions, we built a very strong National Health Service, which is currently collapsing during a socialist government, and also public schools and public universities, and those institutions became really solid after the democratic revolutions and played an enormous role in the development of our country after the dictatorship, because it was a very backward country, and both of them are today experiencing enormous difficulties, underfunding, understaffing, and I would say a strategy for their gradual privatization. And on the other hand, sort of a pillar that was never built in the Portuguese welfare state, housing. There was never really a public social housing policy in Portugal. We have a very, I think it's 2% of public housing, and this means that we have an unregulated market in housing, which is now exposed to the demand of people outside Portugal with higher wages. And this means that
Holiday homes, you mean, for example?
Yeah, also that.
Right.
So we have this really difficult combination between very low wages and very high housing costs.
Okay.
And we're trying now to find ways to deal with that. But it was made worse after the renting market became liberalized with the right-wing government of the Troika, and rents basically shot up.
The Troika being, right, the European Commission and IMF. This is when they came in and saved Portugal, right? Is that it? It saved Portugal from bankruptcy, though you might have a different interpretation.
I do.
on the events. But let's not dwell on history. Let's move on to the European Union of today. And one of the issues that has caught the attention of the team here on the Brussels Signal is forced sterilisation, which I know is something that you've been involved in. We were here shocked to discover that it is technically legal. I think the figure we came across is in 13 member states, forced sterilisation is still legal. How did you get involved in this topic, and what is your goal, please?
So I'm one of the committees I'm involved in is the EMPL committee, the Employment and Social Affairs, which is connected, has been dealing with the issues of disability policies. And in the beginning of the mandate, I got elected as co-chair of the Disability Interparliamentary Group, which is an interparliamentary group is a number of MEPs that share a common concern from all political groups, and that organize to have common initiatives, political initiatives within the parliament. And the disability intergroup is one of the most active in the European Parliament. In that context, the Interparliamentary Group works with organizations from all over Europe that are involved in these issues. And I started working specifically in two topics. One is independent life and the whole policy of deinstitutionalization, having disability public policies that are not about putting people
locking people up, right.
and having services that are spread across the community so that people can have independent lives and still get support from public
right.
policy. And the other is the specific aspect of mental and psychosocial disability, because I felt since I've been working with these issues that there is a big degree of invisibilization of people with disabilities, and within those people an even bigger degree of invisibilization of people with mental or psychosocial disabilities, because there is actually, in some cases, people will say, well, but of course those people can't speak for themselves. And this is not the case. And I've developed some initiatives to struggle against these prejudices.
But on sterilisation, though, in particular?
No, the first one I did was, one of the most important one I did in this mandate was a conference on autism, which was a conference of self-representation. The name of the conference was Autism by Autistic Voices. And I organized it with people from a Portuguese organization of autistic people in self-representation. And I've been working with them after the conference. We were going to publish a book. And they have a campaign with other organizations on the issue of forced sterilization. There's a European petition. And basically they were the ones who came up with these facts. The fact that in several countries there is no explicit ban
right.
on forced sterilization. Probably the practices within countries are different, but in those 13 countries there are still 3 countries, one of which is Portugal, where there isn't even a ban on sterilization of minors. So,
and does it happen?
Yes, it does.
Under what cases, for example?
Well, it's difficult to have actual numbers on this because in many cases there is no consent. In the case of minors, there is consent by their parents or legal guardians. And there are also, when it comes to adults, there are cases where people are not told what the surgery is about, or they are told that it's about something else.
With what justification?
Well, it's tough to respond to that because there isn't really a public argument of people explaining why people with disabilities should be sterilized. No one is in the public arena and say, well, no, right. We feel that this is a good idea. Right. What happens, I think, is that in institutions, dealing with sexual and reproductive rights is a big taboo, and it's usually, I don't want to make a big generalization, but it does happen more in the context of institutionalization, that sexual and reproductive life becomes a complication for the life of the institution.
Okay, so the idea
you solve
doing
that
them good
with the sterilization.
Getting rid of the potential problem, is that maybe it is?
Yeah. I actually visited institutions where I tried to approach the issue of sexual life within the institution,
right.
And usually people don't have anything to say about that. Well, I mean, it's a non-subject. but things are being done to deal with that, and there is no public debate on the issue.
And so is it your goal to have EU legislation in this field? Is that what you would like to see?
Yes, because I think there are certainly areas of disability policy that are outside the scope of EU competence, but not this one. I mean, here we're dealing with very basic fundamental rights that are protected by the treaties, and in my opinion, we're not necessarily talking about having a regulation on sterilisation EU-wide. We're talking about having a general ban on these practices, especially about forced sterilisation.
Has the European Commission reacted?
Well, this whole thing started with a question to Commissioner Dalli.
Right.
Because since we had the petition, we wanted to know if the Commissioner was considering any kind of political initiative on this topic. As you know, the European Parliament doesn't have the right of legislative initiative. So what we're going to do now is to ask, to propose to the COP, the Conference of Presidents, that a debate with a resolution is held at the European Parliament with the purpose of calling on the Commission to put forward a legislative initiative on this topic.
Okay. Well, we could talk more about that, but I would like to spend the time we have with you on some other subjects as well. In particular, given that you have a background as an economist, you have been quoted as saying that joining the euro was a mistake for Portugal. Why?
Well, I think the European integration in Portugal had a process of economic convergence that had very negative impacts in some areas of the Portuguese economy, mostly industrial areas of the Portuguese economy. And there is a critical assessment of the way in which this process of integration was conducted, which I would describe as a too hasty opening to the European market. It's true that, for instance, structural funds were very important to Portugal, especially since we were coming from a very backwards starting point. We had a dictatorship, which was a very extremely conservative, even in economic terms. And I think in this context, joining the single currency was a wrong step, because the Portuguese economy was not ready for that decision. Okay. And I will give you a figure that I think is very eloquent about that. In the years between joining the euro and the financial crisis, our external debt grew to 130, I think, percent of our GDP. And this has to do with the fact that our economy just wasn't ready to lose all of the instruments that are associated with a currency, which is basically monetary policy and exchange rate policy.
Right.
And so the effects on our economy were very heavy and long-lasting. This, of course, is a different debate on leaving the euro.
Right, so you're not in favor of leaving now?
No, I think, I'm in favor of having the European Union built into its policies and its treaties instruments that can deal with economic divergence within the European Union and the Eurozone.
For example?
For example, fiscal policy. I mean, one very singular aspect of this economic space is that we have economies that are united in a single market with free flows of capital, a single currency, which means a common monetary and exchange rate policy, and we have a budget which is 1% of GDP. There is no parallel with this. I mean, if you think, for instance, of federations in other parts of the world, what they have are federal budgets that redistribute between states.
I guess you do have the structural funds here, though, don't you?
Yes, but they're very
still small.
They're irrelevant
right.
in terms. I mean,
Right.
there was once
And the cohesion funds as well. Weren't
cohesion policy is the main, if not the only, instrument against economic divergence, and cohesion policy has been losing importance within the European budget. For instance, there was at some point a proposal by a number of European economists to multiply the European budget by 4, and it would still be, by international standards, an extremely modest budget. But the purpose was that we needed a stronger instrument to promote economic convergence, because it's very clear, I think, that an economic area such as the European Union cannot withstand endless economic divergence. I mean, this is an issue that has to deal with the integrity of the European Union. Now, we've been dealing with that issue through emergency instruments. For instance, the RRF was an important moment. And one of the debates we're having now in the Econ Committee is turning that kind of instrument, which is an investment and also economic stabilization instrument, having it permanently.
Right.
As a part of our tool shed, let's.
Right.
Like
so, but okay. So, bigger. I'm sure in the European Commission they'd be very happy to hear you say that you want the budget to be increased because they would be in charge, right? More money for them. But what you're saying is, if there is more money, it should be diverted towards cohesion-type projects, right? Which would be what, infrastructure-based, or?
Well, I mean, cohesion funds are basically managed by member states, and I think member states will probably have different priorities. You can also have funds that are distributed according to the cohesion rule, which is an economic convergence because it benefits the countries with lesser incomes, but also assigned to specific EU goals. And I think that's a bit more close to what we have with the RRF. And I think, for instance, for the European Union, energy transition is going to be a huge thing, and one that is going to be harmed by the current monetary policy. So it's very important to have strong fiscal instruments to compensate that.
To compensate.
Effect.
Okay. Understood. Now, I want to go on to a more general topic, which is we have had recently the State of the Union address by President von der Leyen. You've been quoted as saying that she was living on the moon. What did you mean when you said that?
Well, I think I was very impressed with the fact that the entire statement of the President of the Commission, with, I would say, one exception, which was the reference to the 8 million of young people that are neither employed nor studying nor in qualification. It was the only reference to actual people living in the European Union in the entire speech. And I think that it's, first of all, this is a debate that we need to have when we have an economic and social crisis in the European Union, when we have 20% of people below the poverty line, when we have statistics saying that 1 out of 3 European people don't have a wage that is adequate to their expense needs and so on. And I think that in a speech on the State of the Union, the President of the Commission has to engage these people, has to talk about some very dire economic and social issues that are currently affecting the Union. And one particular one that I made a reference to is the issue of housing. Now, housing is not a European competence, and there is, for instance, in the RRF, money going into housing policies. But right now, monetary policy is affecting housing in different degrees in different countries. But in several countries where there's a high level of housing credit, which is the case of Portugal, and many people with variable rates, which is also the case of Portugal, this monetary policy is having catastrophic effects, and with very little effects on inflation. That was actually what I was discussing with Madame Lagarde right now. And I think that we need to, so the European Commission is not going to solve the issue of national housing policies, but it should allow for national housing policies to have certain derogations of the rules of the internal market. Because one particular aspect of housing is that it has been commodified. It is very sensitive to financial markets. It's a financialized product today. And at the same time, it's a fundamental right. And what we have in many southern countries is that you have countries with relatively low incomes that are exposed to European demand, which in many cases has nothing to do with giving access to housing to actual people. We're talking about everything from golden visas to buying houses for speculation. You have tourism and so on. And countries need to be able to discriminate.
Do you mean essentially protect certain markets? Is that what it boils down to?
That's exactly it. I mean, we need to protect the housing purpose of housing.
Right. And so it shouldn't be exposed to the internal market, essentially. Is that what you're saying? Countries should have the right to protect. Yeah. Okay. For the good of the people who are less off. And to go back to my original question, you're saying these kind of issues were not mentioned by the President in her State of the Union address. Was that your point when you said she's living on the moon?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk then about the future of the European Union, because in the European Parliament there now has been a draft project drawn up for treaty change. Do you believe that treaty change is necessary to ensure the future of the EU?
Well, yes, in certain aspects I think treaty change would help. For instance, in my areas, I think I would give three main examples. The first one, I think we need treaty change to fundamentally change economic governance rules and the mandate of the ECB. And for instance, I am now rapporteur in the report on new economic governance rules, and there is a big constraint in that discussion, which is the part of those rules which is enshrined in the treaties. Mm-hmm.
And what the ECB can't do, is that what you're saying?
In this case, we're talking about Growth and Stability Pact rules, the 3% deficit, 60% debt, which have been recognized to be arbitrary indicators, but are still in the treaties and that are constraining the debate on how we can have a more rational economic governance framework. On the ECB, we have the issue of price stability, right. Which basically leads the ECB, well, it's not just that, but we have, the treaties say that the ECB has to focus on price stability, basically disregarding everything else.
Including employment, I presume.
Including employment, right. The general state of the economy. Right. And for instance, most central banks have a dual mandate, or at least a primary objective and a secondary objective. And right now what's happening is that a very ineffective monetary policy, ineffective in terms of reducing inflation, because the reduction in inflation is almost exclusively due to the lowering of inflation in energy products and food products, which has nothing to do with the monetary policy of the ECB, and with catastrophic consequences in the economy. And
by which you mean the slowing of the economy and
the
recession.
slowing of the economy, yes. Right. And this is one aspect. To change economic policy in the Eurozone, in the European Union, we do need some degree of treaty change. I would also like to see, this is a minor change, but with big importance, to have European competence in not tax policy, but the policy against tax evasion and tax dumping, which is going on within the European Union. Right now, there is a big race to the bottom in the taxation of multinational corporations. And this happens because there is always a more favorable jurisdiction within the European Union. And basically...
Tax competition.
Yeah, tax competition. And this is bringing rates, especially effective rates, down year by year. And right now, we're less than half the effective taxation of corporations that we had not many decades ago.
Okay. So, but what other issues like abolishing of the veto, do you have a strong opinion on that?
That would be the purpose.
In terms of taxation?
Actually,
right.
I think this is a legal debate. The treaties right now say that you can have a qualified majority vote on taxation issues when
you agree to it unanimously.
No, when you're dealing with an issue that affects the integrity of the single market. Now, tax dumping does that.
So it's technically possible.
Tax dumping is basically public support to the companies residing in your country. And I don't think there's any way you can see this as not being a distortion of the single market. But the problem is you do need to have an agreement on this, on the definition of this problem as a single market problem to be able to have a qualified majority vote. And I feel that, for instance, in the FISC committee, which is a subcommittee of econ, we've had very good reports on some of these issues. The problem is that it's going to be very difficult to have some legislation passing on council on some of these issues, because some member states are making tax dumping a business in the European Union. There was actually a report from the Parliament that described 7 member states as being working in some aspects of their tax policy as offshore jurisdictions.
Do you want to name them?
I don't remember all of them. Luxembourg, Ireland, the Netherlands, Malta. There were 3 more.
Okay, we've already gone past 30 minutes, but I want to ask you one more question. We now have elections coming up next year. Some of the guests we've had here in the studio are predicting that maybe for the first time the traditional partnership between the Social Democrats and the EPP will break down and maybe in favour of a centre-right, right-wing alliance, though the calculations are very complex. How do you see your party and the left in general faring in the next elections, and what will be possible afterwards?
Well, I would say we're not expecting big changes in Portugal as when the left is concerned. I would say that in the rest of the European Union, there are going to be big changes for the better and the worse. I mean, we have some parties that have extremely good electoral prospects, like Sinn Féin or France Insoumise in France. Others not so much, and it's really tough to bet on the actual results. Usually I feel that there is an element of propaganda in those predictions. I mean, people want to get some dynamic going for their political groups.
Yeah.
And I remember some predictions like that bombing in previous mandates. For instance, that's the kind of stuff that I heard in past elections. And this parliament is actually much more surprising than previous parliaments in which I worked, although not as an MEP. For instance, there were several cases, including in committees I work in, where the EPP was politically defeated. And this was something that didn't happen. And well, it was a very rare moment. And there is a positive aspect of this that many times we were able to produce majorities with Renew that has become a
the
bit
Liberals,
of a,
right.
Liberals. There is a negative aspect to this, is that there is a number of issues where the traditional right has been aligning with the far right in Parliament. For instance, one of the most concerning ones is the Green Deal, where we had some big defeats in Parliament due to a majority or a minority. Well, in some cases we had victories with all the right on the other side, and in some cases we had defeats.
Okay. So we could see a polarization of the
there
vote
is a degree of polarization.
And different alliances depending on the subject. I guess that's one possible outcome.
So, but even in that case, I mean, this parliament had a more complicated political life,
right?
And that was good sometimes and not so good other times. But as for the future parliament, well, we'll just have to see.
That's it. Thank you very much for coming in, Mr. Gusmão.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.